They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
Hello, guys, and welcome back to Best Day Ever. As always, I'm your host, Matt McKeever. Reminder, Adam Martin's away this week. He's going to be back, though, on Monday. Right now, he's in Northern Ontario hunting moose. But we've got a full show for you guys today in regards to news stories. There's a lot of different things I want to jump into. In particular, we're going to be giving you an update around the Emergencies Act and what's going on in regards to that. I also want to hit upon the Freedom Convoy and some of the discussions, I guess, around recently we covered that Rachel Gilmore tweet where she talked about 13 children having their chemo delayed because of the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest. I think that this is a great opportunity not only to look at that, but to also explore what's happened over the last 2 years in Canada in regards to cancer screenings. And I kind of think that there's going to be serious consequences for years to come because of some of our public policy positions. Then we're going to talk about Kari Lake. We've also got discussions around scores. This is according to a CBC article, and we'll get into it in a second. But scores of anti-trans candidates. I happen to know one of the people that they're framing as an anti-trans candidate, so I look forward to getting into Mark Parvelos' specific story. I just spoke to him yesterday, so I'll fill you guys in on Mark's side of the story because CBC definitely didn't cover that. We're also going to be talking about Ben Shapiro and the host of H3H3, Ethan Klein. Not sure if you guys have followed along with Ethan Klein, but it feels kind of erratic recently on social media. I'm pretty sure there was a time when he was funny, but what he was saying about Ben Shapiro, I guess maybe I just don't understand his level of humor. We're also going to be talking about a federal judge here in Canada and Brian Peckford's case against the federal government in regards to some of the vaccine mandates that we saw come out. Very frustrating result in that regards. We're also going to be talking about some crazy propaganda coming out of Ukraine and Russia. So when it comes to the fog of war, honestly, I think it's only with hindsight that we'll ever even potentially understand what's truth and what's fiction. Which is very frustrating, but I don't know. I guess it's the nature of conflict. And then I also want to talk to you guys about Canada's energy policy and how it feels like Justin Trudeau is committed to shooting ourselves in the foot. But maybe that's just my partisan take on things. But anyways, there's a lot to cover. I've got a bunch of WTF stories, bunch of story updates. So let's just jump into it. And the first thing I want to discuss with you guys is around the Emergencies Act. So this is from True North. We've referenced them throughout the Emergencies Act inquiry. I think they've got the best coverage and strongly encourage you guys to go over and support them. Tow trucks were en route prior to invoking the Act. Day 6 recap of the Emergencies Act hearing. Tow trucks were already on their way to assist in the clearing of downtown Ottawa prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Acting Deputy Chief of Ottawa Police Services, Patricia Ferguson, revealed at Thursday's Emergencies Act inquiry. Definitely worth going through and reading this entire thread, but just a couple key points I want to hit upon. So Commissioner Paul Rouleau asked Ferguson when exactly Ottawa police conducted that Freedom Convoy protest, went from being a protest to an occupation. Was there any discussion or thought given to how to allow the protest to continue in some form? It seems like it was from black to white. It was a protest of day Sunday, but now it's an occupation. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at? Rouleau asked Ferguson. I'm not sure if there was any conversation about that. Ferguson responded, I know from a command and strategic level, it was that they're here and they're entrenched and they're not leaving. So that is where it switched from a protest to an occupation. I think this is important, right? Because from the very start of the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest, we saw Trudeau denouncing them. I remember sharing with you guys a audio clip where Mark Parvelos called in to the Federal Liberal Party and asked them their thoughts about it before it really blew into what it was. And there was literally that audio clip of a federal liberal employee saying that, oh, we don't think it's going to be a big deal. There's just going to be like tens of people show up to this event. We're not concerned about it. And then once it became a major concern for Justin Trudeau, he immediately just started demonizing the individuals, wouldn't meet with them under any conditions. And it seems like soon as they realized that they were going to use the Emergencies Act, again, there was no room for any sort of nuance to this conversation. It was an occupation now, and it had to be completely rooted out. Right? We needed to make an example of these individuals so they would never dare question Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government again. It's pretty draconian when you really think about how this played out. Particularly, we've covered the host of different lies the mainstream media put out that then the Liberals used to justify, and we end up with this circular logic where random claims and anecdotal stories with no proof would be used as justification for shutting down one of the largest, most grassroots protests that I've personally experienced in my lifetime here in Canada. Further on in the article, this is a direct quote from Abrams. Overall, we had no assaults, no criminality. They kept a lane of traffic open. They did what they said they would do, didn't damage any highways. It was a success getting them into the city of Ottawa. And again, that's from Abrams. So I think this is important to understand as well, right? The constant framing that this was the purge, that it was the end of Canada as we know it, all the crazy hyperbole that came out around this. There's actually literally zero evidence. Downtown Ottawa appears to have become a safer place during the occupation. How? How? How if these are just like crazy individuals that, we shouldn't even consider tolerating them? Again, that's essentially a quote from Justin Trudeau. Should we tolerate these individuals? Now, he said in French, so I guess that allows him to say those things about his own citizenry. Anyways, encourage you guys jump over and check out this. I also just wanted to highlight this opinion piece from Rupa Subramana. Justin Trudeau's case against the Freedom Convoy falls on its face. So she does a good job of kind of summarizing a lot of the different talking points that we've discussed throughout this entire process. So in case you guys haven't watched those videos, you refuse to go back and watch old videos of mine, I don't care. Jump into this National Post article. And again, reminder, I forgot to share it, but I'll share it right after this show. We share all our show notes every single day in the BDE, so Best Day Ever Media's Telegram chat. So again, join the Telegram chat, completely free. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. So we've got comments turned on in the channel as well. It's striking how many public officials, including outgoing Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson, outgoing City Councillor Matthew Fleury, and would-be Mayor Catherine McKenney, made strong claims that the protesters were violent and destructive. For example, Watson claimed that protesters were ripping masks off local residents, but when challenged under cross-examination, he admitted he didn't see this himself, but heard about it in media reports. This was a refrain from many of the public officials making these assertions about the protesters, and when challenged, referred to hearing about it in the media. And again, little tangent here, but like this is just so par for the course of this moment in time with how our government handles us, right? Media comes out with an opinion piece, media comes out with an anecdotal story with no evidence. It's then used in the House of Commons as justification for crazy public measures. And here we are on that slippery slope to tyranny. Continuing on with Rupa's piece here, this was a classic case of the tail wagging the dog, as some media reports were largely parroting the narrative of the public officials without providing much, if any, documentary evidence. Again, remember, we even discussed the example of the anti-Semitic flyers being handed out, and it turns that was literally a screen someone took in Florida that was used. But we had Anti-Hate Canada promoting it. CBC then brings on Anti-Hate as a expert on why the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters are racist. Then it turns out that it's all bullshit. But hey, that CBC article is then used as justification in the House of Commons. And the cycle repeats itself. I am so done with government these days. I don't want any government. You do not speak for me. I'm tapping out. I don't want you in charge of anything anymore. And there was a time when I think I could have at least been libertarian, but I think I have to go full-blown anarchist at this point in time. I'd love to hear from you guys, your thoughts. Leave them in the comment section or comment live if you're watching the video currently. But where do you stand on the scale of politics? Where do you stand on the scale of government? Do you believe that government can at least sometimes be justified? Is there some reason to give a single entity a monopoly over something? Because that's essentially what we grant to the government, right? Is a monopoly over vast aspects of our life. And I think I just consistently see them fucking shit up. And the few things that they don't completely fuck up, they somehow constantly rub our nose in. But I'm not certain that if you weren't to open it up to free competition, to the invisible hand of the market, as Adam Smith would frame it, I kind of feel like we'd end up with similar, if not better, results in every aspect that government currently has a monopoly on. Jumping over to global news now, Freedom Convoy forced kids chemo delays, rescheduling for 13 families, CHEO. So we talked about this briefly, but now Rachel Gilmore's came out with an entire article around the subject matter. And honestly, other than this one data, like this one point, which isn't given any context, that's it. And yet there's an entire article around it, which is just interesting in my opinion. Their care was either delayed or had to be rescheduled. And this is in regards to 13 families who traveled to CHEO for cancer therapy at our medical day unit was significantly impacted by the convoy that occupied downtown Ottawa last winter. So again, that's shitty. If there was 13 kids that had their chemo delayed, like straight up, that's shitty. I'm not going to argue or refute that fact. But I guess what I'd kind of like to know is some context. Is 13 families like a significant portion of families that are getting chemo for their children? Is it a rounding error? How long were these rescheduled? Right? Like, was it like a day because traffic was worse? I would actually kind of like to understand the intricacies behind this, because this honestly feels very similar to some of the other witnesses we've seen the government put forward, like the individual resident that we've discussed previously that referred to the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest in downtown Ottawa as being the purge. That's just beyond the pale, in my opinion. It's just completely unacceptable. So while CHO made sure the families knew CHO was there to provide their care, the spokesperson said the protest made an already difficult situation worse. Yeah, I'm not even going to argue that. Like, I'm sure that when your child has cancer, I'm sure that that's the only thing that matters in your life, and I totally get that. At the same time, for millions of Canadians here, there was real reasonable. There's a real justification for why they need to push back against the vaccine mandates. And I think that the government needs to be ever vigilant in regards to, the citizenry needs to be ever vigilant in regards to its government. Because if we're not vigilant against the government, if the government doesn't believe that there's consequences or that there's any feedback loop to their decision making, they will go way crazier than what we've seen over the last 2 years. And what was interesting, I shouldn't have even looked into it, because Reddit these days is just such a cesspool of terrible hot takes, in my opinion. But it's wild reading a lot of the Reddit comments on this article in particular. I get it. The headline doesn't sound great, right? And, why should those 13 families have any additional stress put on them? But why should millions of Canadians have stress put on them because of their individual medical decisions as well? But what I really wanted to explore was so many commenters in Reddit were focused on this concept of if you want to see real tyranny, go look at the CCTV state in UK, or look at China, or look at this government. I don't give a shit about what other governments are doing. I'm Canadian first, right? Because the Canadian government, for whatever reason, appears to have a monopoly over a lot of the things that impact my life day to day. And I constantly think back to, I think it was this, an Arab tribe, the Boudin, that had a quote. This is kind of a paraphrase of the quote, but me versus my brother, me and my brother versus my family versus my tribe versus my community, or my city versus my state versus the country, my country versus the world. And so what's important to understand there is everything's relative, right? And we need to understand Canadians should be concerned about Canada first. And this idea of comparing other states and how they're more tyrannical or more draconian in nature than Canada, if anything, that's a reason for us to be ever vigilant, right? The price of freedom is ever vigilance. I'm pretty sure that's a Jefferson or Franklin quote. And it's just as true today as it was a couple hundred years ago. And it'll be just as true a couple hundred years from now as it is today. And honestly, I think that those that were protesting the vaccine mandates, the restriction of the freedom of movement of individual Canadian citizens because of their individual medical choices, that is an important line in the sand. That is something that we need to be ever vigilant for. The government shouldn't just get easy layups, right? The government should always be held accountable by the people. Again, the government doesn't speak for me, but when they pretend to speak for me, I'm going to try and hold them accountable to it. Here's a direct quote. The residents living on those streets, having these horns honk literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, plus the diesel fumes, plus roasting a pig on one street, bonfires, lighting off fireworks, having a dance party. It was showing complete disrespect for the people who lived in the city of Ottawa. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. Outside of maybe the first 24 hours of the protest, there was definitely not literally 24 hour a day honking. And it certainly wasn't 7 days a week. And it didn't go on for weeks and weeks, the honking. Secondly, diesel fumes. Okay, yeah, there was probably some diesel fumes because truckers need to heat their cabs in order to stay warm when they went to sleep at night, right? Or in order to warm up. And there's probably a higher amount of diesel fumes than normal in downtown Ottawa. But this isn't like some smoking gun here. This isn't like a reason to like frame these individuals as requiring the Emergencies Act enacted here in Canada for the first time since its creation against its own citizens. The idea that there was a roasting pig on one street, that there were bonfires, lighting off fireworks, probably shouldn't be lighting off fireworks in downtown Ottawa. Having a dance party, how dare they dance? And again, like this is just so bizarre. We've already covered it previously, but there were lanes opened up for emergency vehicles. This didn't actually impact downtown Ottawa the way it's being framed by the government. And it's important we understand this because truth matters. For the love of God, for as long as I live, I'm going to insist that the truth matters and that facts matters and that in fact facts trump feelings. But in this day and age, it seems to be a very contrarian take. But what I want to do now is take these 13 families that potentially had their chemo for their children rescheduled or delayed because of the impacts of travel. Let's look at what's happened over the last couple of years in regards to Canada and cancer in general. So this first article here from the CBC actually just came out quite recently, October 12th, 2022. 400,000 fewer mammograms performed during pandemic, according to the Ontario Medical Association. So again, this is for Ontario, 400,000 fewer mammogram screens for breast cancer. So it says about half of breast cancer cases diagnosed at the Ottawa Hospital before the pandemic were detected through mammograms screenings, but that number decreased to less than 1/3 during the pandemic. What this means is literally less people were catching cancer later, right? Less people are finding out about their cancer proactively because of the different policies that have been implemented over the last couple of years because of the COVID-19 hysteria. That's important. Like you can slice and dice this in multiple ways. One, it's actually going to be more expensive, right? If we can't get in front, if we can't be preventative in a lot of our measures in regards to cancer, it's going to be net a greater expense for the government and for taxpayers in general. Two, obviously there's a cost of life here, right? There's going to be more people dying of cancer because it's going to be caught later on in life. There's going to be a loss of quality of life because certain individuals, again, won't proactively have had their cancer caught through these screenings. And this is just for Ontario. Again, a couple other great statistics in this article, but let's jump over to another CBC article. Cancer that went undetected during the pandemic, an impending disaster, specialists warn. And now this is actually from last year, February of last year. Screening tests and diagnostic procedures for some cancers dropped off sharply during the COVID-19 wave. But according to a report released by the Quebec Ministry of Health last month, an estimated 4,100 people may have gone undiagnosed between March and July 2020 as the health system grappled with the first wave of COVID-19. Now, this was at this moment in time. I believe, and I think it's quite reasonable based upon how we saw a lot of different public policy rolled out since this period in time, that's a trend that continues, right? There's lots of different articles. There's lots of different studies even now coming out showing that like there's going to be huge costs and consequences to the decisions we made during the pandemic. That's why it's so important that we hold the government accountable. That's why it's so important the government actually feel like they might have to justify or come to terms with their decisions versus just being able to constantly move on to the next crisis, move on to the next fear-mongering, whatever it happens to be. Jumping over, we're not going to get too deep into this, but if you guys want, again, there'll be a link in the Telegram chat. Delivery of cancer care in Ontario, Canada during the first year of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, there's a lot of different statistics and points in here. But again, the TLDR here, the overarching theme is that there's going to be significant consequences to our healthcare and significant consequences to individual citizens because of the public policies that were enacted, right? Think about the hundreds of individuals that either were temporarily laid off or were essentially forced to quit or fired because they wanted to make their own medical decisions. And those medical decisions revolved around a vaccine that we've covered previously just this week, where even the CEO now admits that really only those that are 50 plus, those with pre-existing conditions, right, those with comorbidities, really need to worry about it. The same way that essentially they frame the flu vaccine. Well, there's no mandates enforcing every individual to get a flu vaccine. What's the difference with the COVID-19 vaccine? The only difference is how the media, the politicians, and the pharmaceutical companies originally framed it. It only relates to the hysteria that they caused around it that allowed them to get away with these policies. And that's why it's so important that people be able to protest their government. Now, switching gears here, we're going to get back in a second into the vaccine mandates in our first main story of the day, but I want to cover a couple other little story updates, a couple WTF stories, and we'll get back into it. This is from Timcast. Kari Lake denounces critics referring to her as an election denier. It's a crock of BS. Every one of you knows it. We have our freedom of speech, and we're not going to relinquish it to a bunch of fake news propagandists. Kari Lake is, again, like, I don't know everything about Kari Lake, but I've seen her a few times on Tim Pool's Timcast in long form interviews. I've seen her, I think, on Louder with Crowder. Watched a couple of her different talking points, and I think I follow her on social media. I love what she's doing here, and I think it's important that politicians that want to pursue truth, that want to try and improve the systems that we have here rather than just capitulate to them, they need to really come with receipts the way Kari Lake came with receipts here. So here's just a direct quote from this kind of I don't know if it was a news conference or just after the fact thing, but let's talk about election denier Sid Lake, who began reading off headlines and tweets, including the RNC's 150 examples of Democrats denying election results. Lake continued, citing President Biden's press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre's 2020 tweet declaring Republican Governor Brian Kemp stole the election from Democratic challenger Stacey Abrams. Something that Stacey Abrams essentially still repeats to this day, right? We even see her now, even though they've got record turnout in regards to the Georgia election, she's still talking about how she may not use the F word anymore, election fraud, but about how there's still, she has concerns around the election because of the ease of individuals and their ability to vote. Lake continued saying, stole the election from Democratic challenger Stacey Abrams, along with a separate 2019 tweet from the press secretary. The gubernatorial candidate also cited the Washington Post 2019 article, Hillary Clinton, Trump is an illegitimate president, and Los Angeles Times 2018 column piece, was the 2016 election legitimate? It's now definitely worth asking these questions. And yeah, people should always be able to question whether their elections are open, honest, and fair. That's actually a really important part of trying to believe in democracy. You know, if you want to believe in the majority of the tyranny of the majority, if you want to believe in democracy, at a minimum, you need to believe that the majority actually think that, right? In order for democracy to work. Just wild, in my opinion, that we find ourselves in this moment in time, because I remember 2000, right? I'm sure most of you that were alive back then too remember 2000, Al Gore, George Bush, right? And it was very reasonable, in my opinion, for Al Gore to have concerns over Florida and the hanging chads. Very reasonable. And it's wild to think that now in 2020 or in 2022, we can't have the same sort of open discourse that we could have back in 2000. It's hard to not think, when it comes to freedom of speech, individual liberty, that we constantly are taking one step forward, two steps back. I just want to jump over real quick here. This is an AP News article. Registration error affects up to 6,000 Arizona voters. So this directly impacts Kari Lake. And so just real quick, we're going to hit upon this. A problem with the link between voter registration and driver license database may have caused as many as 6,000 voters to be improperly flagged, lacking proof of citizenship documentation on file. Election officials are sifting through the list to determine how many of the 6,000 were improperly flagged. Now, I'm not saying that this is purposeful, but government is made up of people. people are inherently fallible, right? Like people make mistakes. So to think that somehow your government is infallible, but that humans are fallible, it's just bizarre in my mind. Again, you don't even have to necessarily, like, if you want to question legitimacy of an election, you don't even necessarily have to think that there's nefarious bad actors at play here. You could literally just be like, hey, I just want to make sure that the voting machines work the way we believe they work. Maybe we should have open source code around those voting machines so that we can really just shed light on this. I think it's far easier. Like, look at any conspiracy theory, whether it leans towards probably being true or leans towards being crazy, right? If you're if you believe that the earth is round and you hear of a flat earther, I don't think deplatforming the flat earther actually solves the problem. I think you going after the flat earther, even having open discussions and showing tick for tack information and proof, is far more effective in converting the flat earther than simply trying to deplatform them, right? It's honestly that simple. And whenever the government looks to obfuscate things, whenever the government turns to the Ministry of Truth, whenever the government enforces, fact checkers that don't really come with receipts or reframe the argument in a disingenuous way, that doesn't actually serve the purpose that I hope they're seeking here. I hope that they're seeking to actually show and share the truth rather than simply put down anyone that disagrees with them. I hope most governments and most government officials aren't Justin Trudeau, where they just immediately assume that anyone that disagrees with them is evil, and thus you can justify almost anything against that individual because they're evil and you're good. Quickly want to touch upon the dental benefit for children. This is obviously like a situation where I get why people on the surface think this sounds great. Why shouldn't kids have free dental care? Well, are you going to force doctors and dentists to work for free? Well, no, we're not going to force them to work for free. Okay, so you're just going to take more money from taxpayers and force them to pay dentists in order for children to have free dental care. Well, yeah, that's essentially what we're going to do. So understand the proposed dental benefit for children would cost $703 million, parliamentary budget officer. Now, you know what? If I've been tongue-in-cheek here, I would simply bring up, this is actually less money than we've given to Ukraine over the last couple of years, so why shouldn't we give $703 million for free dental care? At least it's going to Canadians. But again, this is the problem with all government spending. You have to force certain individuals to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. Can you really justify that, right? Where's the money coming from? This new $703 million. I wasn't planning on doing this, but let's quickly just Google one of my favorite things, which is, or actually, I think it's just debtclock.ca, right? But let's go to the debtclock.ca that shows the current debt in Canada. Oh, yeah, we're almost at $1.2 trillion. We covered this back in the Maple Pill, but remember the truck that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation drives around showing the growing total of national debt? They literally had to update it to add an additional digit when we rolled over from the hundreds of millions or from the hundreds of billions into the trillion category. Your share, just understand this as a Canadian citizen right now, your share of the total debt is $33,000. So if all of us kicked in an additional $33,000 this tax season, the government, in theory, could pay off all existing debts, but we would still be running a deficit every single day. So right now, there's no fixing this, right? We discussed it yesterday in regards to Liz Truss and her being pushed out of UK politics because she dared to want to implement some austerity. Now, I'm not saying she's perfect. I'm not saying her economic plan was perfect, but it is shocking to see that government, the financial markets, and that, unfortunately, I think the average citizen no longer even understands that you can't just spend indefinitely, that there is consequences to deficit spending. It blows my mind that we're here, but here we are. So again, whenever the government offers you something free, understand that they're either taking that money directly out of your pocket or out of your neighbor's pocket. Okay, moving on. CBC News. We're transitioning now into WTF stories of the day. Scores of anti-trans candidates running in Ontario school board elections. Sounds scary. The normally sleepy contestants for trustee positions have been highly charged this year with faith-based groups, political parties, and self-styled anti-woke organizations involved to an unprecedented degree, including providing endorsements, mobilizing volunteers, and providing candidates training from U.S. political operatives. Sounds pretty scary. But one of the people they cite here, I know that he's not being funded at all. He's got $100 so far. One person donated $100 to his school board campaign, but yet they're going to frame it as this being a highly charged faith-based groups, political parties, U.S. again, that's getting involved in our politics here in Canada. Oh, when did we last hear that? Oh, yeah, when we were told that the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest was mainly being funded by foreigners. It was mainly U.S. MAGA Republicans and Russians that were trying to interfere with Canada's democracy. It was only after we enacted the Emergencies Act, it's only after the government became more of a tyrant against its average everyday citizen that we actually learned that, oh, no, that's not the case. It turns out the vast majority of funding for the convoy protesters were Canadian citizens. And I wouldn't be surprised to learn that the CBC doesn't have receipts here into a lot of their claims. But let's just jump to the one that I personally know about because I spoke to Mark Parvalos. So, for example, Mark Parvalos, a trustee candidate in Guelph, Ontario, has repeatedly taken to social media to deny the existence of trans and non-binary genders. And here's the proof. Here's the receipt they've got from a tweet. And again, rather than link to the actual tweet, this is just the only comment they have, or the only fact that they provide. There are men, there are women, that's it. Yeah, well, he sounds pretty fucking extreme there. No, actually, I'm pretty sure, like, back when I was 16 getting my driver's license, you had to identify male or female. Doesn't seem actually that fucking extreme. And what's more is, they go on to say neither Parvalos or Rekar, I don't know Rekar personally, responded to requests for comment. Well, Mark spoke to Mark yesterday when this article broke. He said, nope, they didn't reach out to me. And again, maybe they reached out to him at a defunct email address. Maybe they reached out to him, minutes before the article published, but Mark actually didn't receive the request. And this even frames it as, later on in the article, they essentially frame it as a lot of these individuals don't want to be interviewed. Mark has a daily show where he spends an hour every single day. He doesn't even take weekends off. Every single day for the last, 100, like, he might be in like the 900 range now of episodes. So he's been doing this for years. And he talks for like 45 minutes to an hour, shares all his thoughts and opinions. There's no way, I know Mark, there's no way had they reached out to him for a request that he wouldn't have wanted to talk about the subject matter, because he thinks it's very important to be involved in your children's education. He was formerly a early childhood educator. I'm not sure the exact term, but something like that, right? Worked with children. So Mark is very passionate about this. He's got a background in this, and he loves to talk about the subject matter. Just wild the way the CBC decides to go about their form of journalism. So yeah. Anyways, if you guys want to sink your teeth into it, this is actually a very long and thorough article. How factual it is maybe leaves a bit to be desired. Though many of the trustee candidates running on anti-woke platforms are vocal on social media about what they oppose, few outside the Ottawa area were willing to discuss their platforms. Again, Mark's on social media every single day, sharing his thoughts, sharing his platform. It's bizarre to see them do this, but I think that honestly, journalists like Jonathan Montpeat here, they're so confident that there'll never be consequence to their white lies or stretching the truth that they just run with this shit, right? And they know that the average citizen either isn't going to have the time or the interest to sink their teeth into this subject matter. But this shit's important, right? Do you, honestly, just taking a step back, what do you want your government funded institutions and education programs to focus on? Should they be focusing on writing, reading, arithmetic? Maybe if we've got time, we can fit in a little bit of science, a little bit of civics, right? How many Canadians leave high school actually understanding how the Canadian government works? I know I sure as fuck didn't. Maybe you could rhyme off a couple random dates. Maybe you could rhyme off, like, there's the House of Commons and there's members of Parliament and, they're from ridings. But how many people actually understand the intricacies, right? And this is something that, oftentimes during the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest, a lot of individuals, when mainstream media would interview them, they would kind of say, like, hey, you don't know a lot about Canadian politics because you're talking about freedom of speech, right? You're talking about a lot of the principles of America versus what the actual rules are here in Canada. And we are certainly not as free in Canada as America. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to become as free as America. In fact, I would love to see that become the social norm here in Canada. But honestly, our education system, I believe, fails us at so many different turns. Why would you trust them to teach gender inclusive policies, even if you wanted gender inclusive policies be taught to your children? Why not take that on as your individual goal as a teacher? Or like, if we're going to have publicly funded gender teaching and sex ed classes and all that stuff, why not make it optional? Why not make it an after school class? Or why not just make it an optional class that people can pick up in their grade 11 or grade 12? I don't see why this has to be taught so young. I don't even see why it needs to be taught in the first place by the government. I'd much rather see individual parents make these decisions for themselves. Again, if you want to teach that stuff, awesome. You do you, right? But if you don't want to, or you want to teach something different, you do you again. Yeah. Anyways, let's keep rolling because I'm halfway through the show and I haven't got into really the main stories yet. Real quick here from Louder with Crowder, another WTF story. CNN claims your pets are destroying the planet, demands you stop feeding them meat. Yeah, because that's the natural way of the world, right? Is dogs and cats should be on vegan diets. Next, from Post Millennial, Ben Shapiro responds to Ethan Klein's death wish against him. So first things first, just for some context here, because I don't expect you guys to be up to date on every single social media influencer. Both of these individuals, based upon my understanding, they've got Jewish ancestry, right? So I think that that's important to highlight here, at least to a certain degree. Now, Ethan Klein said something on social media and YouTube that I'm pretty sure that, you know, if I was to get reported for this, I would get a strike against me. So I'm not even going to necessarily read it. You guys can read it on screen here if you're so inclined. But essentially, he's talking about if there was to be another Holocaust, that he would hope that Ben Shapiro would be one of the people impacted first. Pretty extreme. And in fact, that's actually very extreme. And I don't get the humor at all. And so Ben Shapiro went to social media to respond to this. And, you know, again, Ben Shapiro, regularly framed by mainstream media as this crazy extremist, right, with unacceptable views. You know, he's essentially everything Justin Trudeau hates. If there were another Holocaust, I would hope that Ethan and his family escaped, but maybe that's just me. Who would wish a Holocaust on anyone? Straight up. Who wishes genocide on any individual human or their family? It's sick. It's disgusting. Now, again, if you're not directly inciting it, if you're not making a direct threat to that individual, I technically think you should have the freedom of expression to say these things. But I also think that, you know, people can condemn you for your thoughts and opinions. There can be consequences, not from the government, but from individuals towards your decisions, right? And that's really what I'd much rather see, is individuals being responsible for enforcing their own social mores and ethics on their own communities and societies, rather than a top-down approach from government officials. Ben Shapiro goes on, soft-peddling genocide terror group Hamas and lying about the IDF while courtling over which Jews go first in the next Holocaust is also an interesting look. And so this just refers to a tweet that Ethan Klein put out about the IDF and Hamas. And again, I think that Ethan really struggles for nuance these days. I think he's constantly chasing clickbait. He's trying to appease the woke mob. We saw him previously. I don't think we discussed it because it's not necessarily a big deal, but he recently went back and removed all his references to Jordan Peterson, right? He had Jordan Peterson on his show at least once, but he removed all that, all the micro content around it, because Jordan Peterson has gone against the mainstream orthodoxy. And obviously that's unacceptable in our modern era. So if you guys want to go down that rabbit hole, again, links to this as well as all the other stories in the Telegram chat. Next, from Fox News, disgraced ex-FBI agent tells MSNBC 9/11 is nothing compared to January 6th. It gets worse. An ex-FBI agent, Peter Strozik, called the same urgency and war footing as the September 11th terror attack. There is no tragedy too small. There is no emergency too small. There is no inconvenience too small that at least one government official or former government official won't try and use as justification for more rules, for more bureaucracy, for stripping you away of your rights to a further degree. And this is definitely another case in point. But let's roll on. I want to jump over. I got to pull up a different tab because of the way my browsers work. But this is from the Epic Times. This is something I'm not seeing a lot of coverage right now in mainstream media. But damn, is this actually important for Canada? Federal court judge rejects travel vaccine mandate lawsuits over mootness. So buckle up here, guys. This is an important part of the show. In fact, I think this is probably the most important story for the average Canadian we're going to cover today. Justice Jocelyn Gagné published a short decision that didn't explain her rationale, saying it would come at a later date. Gagné ruled in favor of mootness motion brought forward by the Attorney General, AG, on January 28th, 8 days after the federal government lifted its domestic vaccine mandates for planes, trains, and some marine vessels. Millions of unvaccinated Canadians were unable to use these means of transportation starting October 2021 or to leave the country given U.S. border restrictions. The AG's motion argued that since the mandate had expired, it did not exist as law, and hence a court ruling on the matter would have no practical effect. Challengers to this mandate pleaded that dismissing their case would allow the government to impose controversial measures and argue mootness to avoid accountability. The challengers have 4 different lawsuits. One includes businessmen Carl Harrison and Sean Rickard, another former Newfoundland Premier Brian Peckford, and co-applicants PPC leader Maxe Bernier also filed along with Quebec lawyer Nabil Bekelsom. And the reason I thought it was important to highlight all these individuals because these are actually Canadian heroes. These are actually people that want to see the Canadian government held accountable for its decisions. The fact that the government can enact a law, but if by the time the courts get around to reviewing it, it's no longer enacted, that we no longer have to review this court case. Like, let that sink in. That means as long as the government does something bad, but does in a short interval before the courts can catch up to it, there's no accountability there. So what does this mean? This means that the government decides to implement vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, restrict our individual liberty and movement next time, which there will be a next time now based upon this. Again, we'll have to start the whole cycle over again. And if they wrap it up before it gets to court again, they'll be able to cite mootness again. This is insane. Imagine if the same thing happened with the Emergencies Act, right? We already saw with the Emergencies Act when it was enacted, that it didn't go to Senate because they withdrew it before it was even going to go before Senate because maybe it wasn't going to pass Senate or maybe they were going to ask questions or demand answers that were going to be inconvenient to Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government. Imagine if we couldn't have the Emergencies Act inquiry now because the Emergencies Act wasn't still invoked. That would be beyond absurd, in my opinion. This is beyond absurd, in my opinion. I don't care which side of the political spectrum you're on. You should always want to see your government held accountable. If you believe that vaccine mandates and passport restrictions around your vaccine status were extremely important, if you hate individuals that are unvaccinated, you should still want to see this go before the court, if for no other reason than to show that Justin Trudeau and his government did the good thing. They did the right thing. That Canada wants to be a country with no individual liberties. Let's at least get to the bottom of this for the love of God. This is crazy. This is unacceptable. But there'll be no consequences because it's moot. Okay. Let's move on to the Ron Paul Institute. And again, this one's a doozy as well, in my opinion, when it comes to politicians, their lies, mainstream media backing them up, and the deep state. They're recycling the Viagra rape atrocity propaganda they used on Libya. You guys maybe don't remember this. I'd have forgotten about this story as well. But we're seeing it come out. Russia is giving soldiers Viagra to rape Ukrainians, UN official. Now, if you don't remember, this actually should remind you of a story about 10 years ago. And because of our 24-hour news cycle and mainstream media's constant desire to prop up our governments and their mainstream talking points, we're probably only going to see the Ron Paul Institute highlighting this sort of thing. In a Thursday interview with the French government-owned news agency AFP, a Martian British official from the United Nations named Pramila Patten claimed that Russia has a military strategy of mass rape in Ukraine and that Russian soldiers are being equipped with the erectile dysfunction medication Viagra in order to facilitate that military strategy. Now, I gotta be honest, just even on the surface, this sounds absurd, right? You would have to have such an extreme position as a political party, as a government, to be giving out Viagra to soldiers and being like, please rape the enemy. That's the sort of thing that only literally the darkest of hearts could envision. And to think they could be played out en masse in a conflict like what's going on in Ukraine right now, or like what was going on in Libya back in the day, is just bizarre. I don't I might believe that Hitler or Stalin is capable of those sort of policies. I might be able to believe that the CCP, in fact, yeah, I could be talked into the fact that the CCP is probably capable of that sort of policy as well. But to think that like Russia at this moment in time would be enacting that, like, what is the actual gain? Honestly, again, these individuals that go in front of the media, that go in front of the UN, are so comfortable lying to us. Think back to the atrocities that were used to justify us getting involved in the first Iraq war, right? They were talking about in Kuwait that babies were just being smashed on the ground out of incubators. Oh, but it turned out that was actually wasn't it the this a Saudi embassy member's uh daughter that like said that, or a Kuwait, sorry, I think it was a Kuwait embassy member's daughter that essentially gave that testimony, which turned out to be completely unfactual. But hey, it got us into the war. Once we're into the war, you can't question being in the war because good guys, always us, versus the bad guys, always them. So, because the AFP is one major propaganda multipliers whose material is republished by news media outlets around the world, Patton's completely unevidenced claim of weaponized Viagra has been uncritically reported as a real news story by outlets like CNN, the New York Post, Forbes, The Independent, The Hill, Yahoo News. This claim will now be folded into many rank and file mainstream news consumers' understanding of what is happening in Ukraine, despite its brazenly propagandistic nature. Um, the only other time the West has been hammered with a story about marauding Viagra armed rape brigades like this was in 2011 when the Western Empire was circulating atrocity propaganda to manufacture consent for a regime change, interventionism in Libya. In March of that year, an email later published by WikiLeaks was sent to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton by her private advisor, Sidney Blumenthal, informing her for an unconfirmed rumor that Libya's longtime leader, Mohammed Gaddafi, has adopted a rape policy and has even distributed Viagra to troops. Blumenthal notes that this claim originated from the rebel side of the conflict, which we now know included Al Qaeda, whom Gaddafi had been fighting. The following month, that rumor was repeated before the UN National Security Council by Susan Rice, another Obama administration official, this time presented not as a rumor but as a reality. Although anonymous U.S. military intelligence officials informed the press the very next day that they had no evidence of Rice's claim, by June, an international criminal court investigation was underway, with Western news media continuing to uncritically report claims of weaponized Viagra in Libya. Meanwhile, another UN human rights investigator named Sharif Bazouni said he'd found those allegations to have arisen from massive hysteria and that both sides of the conflict had been making them about the other. Amnesty International failed to turn up any evidence of mass rapes and weaponized Viagra in Libya. And a 2016 report by the British Parliament found that false humanitarian intervention by NATO forces, which resulted in Gaddafi's death, had in fact been based on lies. Like, literally, we just repeat the same cycles time and time again. And in the age of internet, in this information age, there's no excuse for it. We should know better. We should remember the past. We should hold the bad actors accountable for their bad actions and try to ensure that we don't make bad actions again in the future. And yet instead, we just literally like they're literally too lazy to even come up with a new lie to tell us. So they copy pasta the thing that worked back in 2011 and hope that we're all just too stupid to remember it. Or that by the time we remember it and try and hold them accountable, that it's too late because we've already escalated the war in Russia. Now, one thing that people will constantly push back on is like, well, if you're like pushing back against this propaganda, then you're pro Putin, you're pro Russia. No, I can be anti Russia and anti NATO interventionism and anti fake propaganda at the same time. I literally can hold all those beliefs without believing that I'm in conflict in any way internally. And it just, I don't know, it just drives me insane that this is where we're at right now. But let's talk about some other crazy propaganda that's being shoved down our throat. And again, in regards to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russia-Ukraine accuse each other of plotting mass casualty false flag events. As The Hill reports, the Ukrainian leader's explosive accusation, speaking to a meeting of the European Council, Zelensky said his country has evidence that Russia has planted mines at the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant and could be preparing to blow it up, warning that such an attack could flood the critical city of Kherson and cause cooling issues at Europe's largest nuclear power plant. The dam dam of this hydroelectric power plant holds about 18 million cubic meters of water, he said. If Russian terrorists blow up this dam, more than 80 settlements, including Kezerson, will be in the zone of rapid flooding. Hundreds of thousands of people may be affected. He described that Russian forces previously kicked the dam workers out of the facility and now have complete control over it. They have complete control over the station, Zelensky added. It is necessary to act immediately so that Russia does not have the opportunity to realize this catastrophe. Now, this kind of reminds me about that story that we heard where Russia was trying to essentially attack a nuclear power plant, right? And they were trying to like blow it up. But then as more information came out, that narrative kind of eroded because it turned out that Ukraine was also fighting and attacking that nuclear power plant. I just, like, why do we believe these assholes? Why do our tax dollars go to support these wars? I don't, like, one, if you're a Russian citizen, you should be pissed as hell that Putin got you into this war. You should be so angry that your tax dollars go to fund this unjust war. And if you're a Ukrainian, you should be upset that your government believes lie at all costs, right? Because again, that seems to be the mainstream narrative. And if you're a NATO member, you should be mad that your governments are frothing at the mouth to escalate this conflict with Putin, that under no circumstances are they willing to come to the table to negotiate. This is just wild. This desire for total warfare. And I'm completely done with it. I am checked out. I don't want any of my tax dollars going to this bullshit. You do not speak for me. All right, jumping over to Spencer Fernando now. On energy policy, Trudeau refuses to acknowledge reality. We have been given a brutal reminder of why democratic nations must take full use of our natural resources. Trudeau appears to think the exact opposite has occurred. So the reality is that we live in a world where the power to defend territory and defend our values still depends on being able to extract resources from the ground and use those resources to build up our economy. That economy must also be able to build real things, including weapons. Tangible things must be built, or a civilization cannot thrive. Unfortunately, Justin Trudeau seems not to understand this. In recent remarks, he claimed that Putin's attack on Ukraine will accelerate the end of Canada's oil and gas sector. And this is just such crazy backward thinking. Literally, these politicians seem to have like a handful of talking points, and they just, regardless of whether it makes sense or not, they're going to shoehorn it into where they think it belongs. So while Trudeau acknowledged that the Russian invasion had caused global demand to surge for Canadian sources of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and crude oil, he predicted that the net effect would be a faster phase out of the Canadian oil and gas sector. Think about this. The world needs more LNG, and our prime minister's like, hey, that'll mean we should shut down our LNG faster. Right now, in the coming couple of years, we're going to need to continue with the mechanisms we have, but the move off of fossil fuels is going to happen much faster because of Russia, he said. This literally, like, unless you're willing to let millions be impacted and potentially like hundreds, maybe thousands, who knows what the cost could be, but a lot of people are going to suffer in Europe this winter, and potentially a lot of people will die. Literally because of the cold. If you look into the statistics, more people die because of the cold than the heat. And this is one of the things that individuals like Alex Epstein, who sometimes is daring to go against the climate alarmism hysteria that we currently have in society, and explore like, hey, let's say that the climate is changing. In fact, it seems like the climate's always very dynamic. So yeah, it's probably going up or going down. It's probably not just staying at a very static position. How does that actually impact humanity? How does that impact our ability to thrive on this planet? Well, it turns out right now, more people die because of extreme cold than extreme heat. Never hear that in the mainstream media. Weakness and guilt-based thinking empowers dictators. Justin Trudeau's remarks are a stunning mix of mendacity, ignorance, and naivety. For years and years, people like Trudeau have been demonizing Canadian history, destroying confidence in our nation, and trying to make people feel guilty for wanting to be rich and prosperous. The energy sector, which is a tremendous gift we should be grateful for and which creates opportunities for the advancement of our country, has been cast as something negative and strangled at every turn. Completely agree with Spencer here. Encourage you guys, check out this article. It'll be in the Telegram chat right after this episode because I forgot to post it before. Rex Murphy also has an opinion piece in regards to this. Even green zealots fear the cold more than the evils of natural gas. So just a couple points here. The virtue states went green, but contented themselves with getting the slack, the dirty oil and gas stuff they so deplored from reliable Russia. They are not smirking now. Germany, in the warm haze and fuzzy thinking of progressive thought, broke the bank on their master green plan, the great Energiewende, to get off planet destroying fuels and nuclear, which proved to be a massive multi-billion-dollar mess and a failure. Sha. As a footnote to the Energiewende, I'm definitely mispronouncing that, opera, be it noted, at the end of September, the German government announced is spending $194 billion to cap natural gas prices for households and businesses. That's a bigger price tag than the US $172 billion the UK government was expected to spend to finance its own price cap. Germany went green with a vengeance and now has to mail out checks to its citizens to compensate for the folly. Hundreds of billions of dollars is actually a lot of money, guys. It's just literally a lot of money. When we talked about earlier in the show that it's under $1 billion to give dental care to kids under the age of 12 here in Canada, think about where this money could have been spent otherwise to help the citizenry of Europe. It's just, spoiler alert, but they kind of hate us. They, being politicians, the elites, mainstream media, the powers that be, those that think that they're a step above the average person. They see us as extremely inconvenient, and they can't wait to try and reduce our impact. Final story here from Brownstone. Appreciate those of you listening to me rant on a Friday. Smash the like button, hit subscribe, jump in the comments section if you're enjoying this. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me. But let's jump over to the Brownstone Institute now. It's coming up in a fortnight. For many people, I forgot to lead with the title here, but will elections change anything? It's coming up in a fortnight. For many people, all their hopes rest on the outcome. I get it because these seem like very dark times. We cannot live without hope, but we also need realism. The problems are deep, pervasive, and scandalously entrenched. Many people won financially and in terms of power from lockdowns and have no intention either to apologize or give up their gains. What's more, for that to have happened to this great country and many great countries indicates something far more pernicious than a policy error or an ideological mistake. The fix is going to require vast change. Tragically, the elected politicians may be the least likely to push for such a change. This is due to what we call the deep state, but there ought to be another name. It is rather obvious now that we are dealing with a beast that includes media, technology, nonprofits, and multinational and international government agencies and all the groups they represent. Further on in the article, indeed, the entire system seems rigged against change. It starts with the permanent staff on Capitol Hill. It's a tribe. They move from office to office. They all know each other and also the permanent staff of the bureaucracies who serve the Congress. And they in turn have close relationships with the permanent staff of the executive bureaucracies, who in turn have close relationships with the media and the corporate executives lobbying the congressperson. The naive people, no matter how well intended, are quickly surrounded. This is precisely why there needs to be a focus as never before on the problem of the administrative state. It has to be penetrated and apart piece by piece. That will involve not only constant investigations, but also courageous bills that seek not cuts, but full-on defunding of whole agencies one after another. That's what it will require to make genuine change. What's more, there might only be one chance to do this before it is truly too late. My current read on the situation, and this is from Jeffrey Tucker from the Brownstone Institute. My current read on the situation is the GOP is not ready for the job. Recall that there was a red wave in 1994 too, and essentially nothing good came of it. It was a massive and devastating disappointment. That cannot be allowed to happen again. In the end, what's more powerful than political changes and even election upheavals, which too often failed through subversion, are dramatic shifts in public opinion. Every institution ultimately bends to that, which is why research, education, great journalism, and competent media outlets, plus friendship networks and community organizing might actually be more foundational than elections. All this has begun and is growing. Therein lies the real hope. I just want to second this because I know sometimes when I get ranting here, things can seem very dark. But what Jeffrey Tucker laid out here is absolutely true. Elections, honestly, at this point in time, I don't think elections are changing jack shit. They're rearranging the chairs on the sinking Titanic. But when you start to speak the truth, when you live within the truth, when you seek the truth, when you refuse their lies, when you focus on what you can control, when you focus on bettering yourself, when you focus on bettering your community, that shit spirals and spills over into the culture. And as the culture changes, politicians will eventually have to bend the knee. That's it. That is the white pill today. Again, I swear to God, this is a white pill, guys. Now, because Adam's not here, we're not going to do our Friday hangout, but we'll be back on Monday talking about more news stories, as well as getting the second half of the show, which will be on a business topic. And I'll be back and joined by my co-host, Adam Martin. Appreciate you guys hanging out with me. Hope you had a great day. And got some comments, but they appear to not be in a language I can read. So I'll take them as compliments. Appreciate that. Anyways, I'll see you guys on Monday. Same time, same place, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks, guys.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your